It's another hour of In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro. Occupy has more precedent in America than you might think. Unions forming under threat of unemployment, injury, or death, a vast wealth divide, the government overly influenced by the money. It has all happened before, and I am not talking about the 1920s Gilded Age. Occupy through an historic lens coming up this hour on In Deep. It always sounds like the sun coming up over the mountainside. And then the ears rise over the top and you realize there's a clown nose right behind it. It is our very own demented sidekick Buttercup, GottaLaff, with her particular take on the news of the week. Gotta, welcome.
Do you know that I actually carry a clown nose in my car, so when people are rude to me and flip me off, I put it on and just stare at them and they don't know what to do?
Why does this not surprise me? Of course you have a clown nose in your car.
But I've been really busy, actually. I've been marveling at the brevity of Newt Gingrich's I Quit speech.
Oh, good Lord, yes.
Oh, never mind, it was 23 minutes long. Oh, my God.
It was like an Academy Award speech on steroids. And you kept waiting for the band to play him off, and the band kept not showing up.
It was Palin-esque word salad. It was unbelievable. It was coleslaw. It was dog meat ground up. It was awful. I sat there. I was live tweeting it, and I was marveling at his insanity. He's just gone off the deep end.
What is it about the Republican Party that seems to do that to people? John McCain kind of went off into Neverland. I mean,
well, look, Romney's no winner either. I mean, they're just Michelle Bachmann. Can we talk?
Oh.
I mean, this is insane. This group of people, they're ready for their new crop. They definitely are.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the current crop being Mitt Romney. You found a little bit of interesting video with him.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, there's always a little bit of interesting video with Mitski. Are you talking about the pin video?
Yeah.
Yes, he was at a Virginia fundraiser, and he was talking to his fundraisees, and he was bragging a little bit when he was running the Salt Lake City Olympic Games back in 2002. He commissioned United We Stand pins for the games, just for right after 9/11.
Very patriotic.
Very patriotic. And what he failed to note was that those pins were made in China.
Oops.
And then, it gets better. Lynn Sweet of the Chicago Sun-Times was talking about being on a conference call hosted by the Republican National Committee yesterday, attacking President Obama for high unemployment, and the call was hosted by a firm in the Philippines. So
no.
Yes. Outsourcing are us. This is it's blatantly awful. And this is after all the smears they did of Obama back in 2008 for not wearing his lapel pin one time, or for saying he doesn't have to wear one to show he's patriotic. And then when John McCain came on without his lapel pin, nobody said word one. But, Cluster Fox and the GOP were just gleefully smearing Obama for not wearing his lapel pin at every single outing.
Yikes. Well, and then we have Ann Romney, who once again tried to prove her common touch with the common people.
Yes, she just can't win this. But this woman, she's going on and on about what it's like. She knows what it's like to struggle, which in a sense she does because she's had some terrible health issues. But she goes on air telling everybody that there's a wild and crazy man inside of unzipped exterior Romney.
The terrifying vision.
Terrifying vision. And she, meantime, was wearing a silk T-shirt that cost $990. Now, before everybody gets their back up and says, well, so what if they're rich? That's right. So what if they're rich? That's okay. It's the hypocrisy, stupid. It's their sense of entitlement. It's that they go around saying how much they've struggled when, in fact, most of us struggle to buy a $9 T-shirt and health care that she can afford, without even blinking. It's when they go around accusing Democrats of being detached elitists and getting $400 haircuts while Paul Ryan is spending $350 on wine. While Obama's saying he wishes kids could attend college, they're calling him a snob. They're calling Kerry a snob because he windsurfs. But the Romneys, Mitt pals around with NASCAR and NFL team owners and buys Ann 2 Cadillacs, and they have car elevators and $12 million homes with 3,600 square foot basements added on.
You know what? You need to put your clown nose on for a while. I'm worried about how intense you're getting here. Breathe, be in your space, because we get to laugh together now because we're going to move on over to Shep Smith on Fox.
I'm in my happy place now.
Oh my God! Yeah, this was brilliant. And let's hear a little taste of Shep Smith on Fox here.
So Newt Gingrich is going to do what he's been doing for all this time, and that's keep raising money and trying to sell books. After all, he's written 3 novels on Subject A, 4 novels on... I don't know anybody on his side of the political aisle who can stand him anymore. Politics is weird and creepy, and now I know lacks even the loosest attachment to anything like reality.
Yes, he had just watched Gingrich's speech, his I Quit speech, and he said something like, well, to the 2 of you who stayed with us. And he even said, wow, what just happened? I mean, he just had, all these wonderful reactions that we were all thinking, but he said them on Cluster Fox.
Yes. I kind of wonder if he serves a purpose for Fox, because when they get accused of the kind of bias that they so evidently specialize in, they can say, oh, well, Shep Smith doesn't like so-and-so. I mean, he serves a purpose.
He does, but it's also so satisfying for us that it's okay if they want to use him.
GottaLaff. I always appreciate your perspective on the news. Have yourself a lovely weekend.
This is a very non-intense thank you and goodbye.
GottaLaff writes for thepoliticalcarnival.net. You'll find some of her work linked from our website at indeepradio.com. This is In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro. This hour, to some extent, we're continuing our conversation on Occupy, but we're going to go beyond that, too, to some of the societal and economic structures that Occupy and we on the left are fighting, and as you'll discover this hour, have been fighting for decades and decades. My guest in the studio is Dr. Larry Shoup. His website is rulersandrebels.com. He's an academic, an historian, and an author, and it's a description of his most recent book that tells you exactly why he's here for today's conversation. So I'll just give it to you verbatim. Listen to this. Rulers and Rebels, A People's History of Early California, 1769 to 1901, is a unique motherlode of little-known, almost forgotten aspects of early California history. It's written from the point of view of, and often in the very words of, the rebellious, workers, Native people, women, African Americans, immigrants, and the poor. What is common to these stories of resistance is they have been excluded from the orthodox histories, the standard textbooks, and the most powerful media outlets. Rulers and Rebels makes it clear that any human rights we possess do not come from lawmakers and courts. They only become real and alive when we engage in direct action powerful enough to win our rights for ourselves. In this respect, the history of the rebellion and resistance of the majority reflects our real voice, releasing us from feelings of powerlessness and self-blame, while at the same time challenging everyone to continue the struggle for a more substantial and advanced democracy with real equality, solidarity, and social justice. And with those credentials and that very, very heavy justification, Larry Shoup, thank you so much for coming in.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Well, the book is surprisingly, even though it's technically a history, and it technically ends in 1901, I mean, we're obviously talking about some of the very same issues we have today.
Exactly, yeah. We're struggling against a ruling class that's increasingly international, that's extremely powerful, that fights for its own interests, that is quite unified. And the thing that's exciting about the Occupy is we're trying to get the working people, the working class, unified and together. So this latest May Day, which I participated in, of course, brought together workers, united workers and unions, brought together immigrant folks, and brought together the Occupy folks. And we need to be trying to unify the American working class to fight for our own interests, because the capitalist class, the rulers, they're obviously fighting for their own interests. And even as Warren Buffett, one of the capitalists himself said, there's a class struggle going on and we're winning. And we see the results of that victory. And that is high unemployment, increased exploitation of workers in terms of lower wages and decreased living conditions, unions being gradually undermined or destroyed, and the very life-sustaining ecologies that we need as a species, as a human species, are now increasingly under threat because of the lack of concern by the 1% that's ruling us. Don't really care about whether they're destroying ecologies. Their horizon is, well, can I get more wealthy in the next 5 or 10 years? Not what's going to be happening in, even a decade. We're seeing deterioration of the life-giving ecologies that that humanity and all life forms on the planet depend upon is being destroyed. So we have to get ourselves together as a class, because the 99% is the alternative to this destruction, to this exploitation, to the increasing inequality that we're seeing in our society, where the rich are fabulously, unbelievably wealthy. You can't even imagine the kind of wealth and power they have, and increasingly their average person is unemployed or having trouble getting a job or having trouble making a living.
One of the things that I find really interesting is that we keep hearing comparisons to the Gilded Age, the 1920s, the railroad barons, the people who made money that up to then had only been dreamt about in American society, although we'd seen it in the moneyed, thrones, on the moneyed thrones in Europe. Your history goes from 1769 to 1901. But it looks as though there were already parallels to what would come later in the 20s, and then again in the 80s, and again what we're dealing with now, this big haves and have-nots. What was it like, in the timeline that you were studying?
Well, very, very similar. We had increasing inequality. We had increasing power of the capitalist class, of the people that own the means of production, and the average person has to go to that capitalist class hat in hand trying to get a job. So you saw throughout the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, increasing exploitation, increasing wealth on the part of the robber baron equivalents. And so by the time you get to the 1890s, you get a very sharp class struggle. I mean, it took place, of course, before in the earlier period with the missions and the Indians rebelling against the missions. And then there was a period we could call somewhat of a golden age in the because it was the gold rush, where people could go out and stake a claim and then have some a way to make a living without having to get a job from a owner of a big factory. But that ended very quickly. And gradually, as this time progressed in the 19th century, you had more and more sharp class struggle in it, and it came to its head in the 1890s and in 1901. And that's why in my book of 1901, there was a big general strike on the waterfront in San Francisco, where the workers took over the waterfront, froze it, shut it down, because there was an employers association in San Francisco that decided that San Francisco should be what they called an open shop. That is, there should be no unions in San Francisco. Unions were growing because the workers wanted some way to unite and fight for their own interests. But the bosses wanted to destroy the unions. So one day when people came to work in 1901, the bosses said, well, do you want to work or do you want to be in your union? You have to make a choice. And the workers said, no, we're not going to give up our unions. We're going to fight. So they had a big alliance for the waterfront unions, all the Sailors Union of the Pacific, the Longshore, a number of others, the Teamsters, a number of other smaller unions came together and shut down the entire waterfront for 2.5 months. It was an amazing strike. A number of people were killed, of course. There was a lot of violence. The bosses hired gun thugs. The police were on the side of the bosses, on the side of the Employers Association. But the workers won that struggle, and that's why there were still unions there in 1934 when they had another big waterfront strike, another big general strike in San Francisco. And I should mention also in 1894 there was an amazing strike that's another chapter in Rulers and Rebels, and that's the Pullman strike in California. Most people think of the Pullman strike as a Chicago phenomenon.
The railroad, right.
But it was in California. There was a American Railroad Union, which was the Debs-led union that did the Pullman strike in 1894 in California, that was underground, because if the workers said they were in a union, they would have all been fired, because the Southern Pacific, the dominant force in California, politically and economically, and of course they were the railroad company, they would fire anyone who was known to be in a union. So the unionists were secret, but when they said, we're going to boycott the Pullman cars, the unionists came out and said, yes, we're members of the American Railroad Union, we'll boycott the Pullman cars. And then the railroad said, well, you're all fired. And at that point, the workers took over the railroad system. And they had 2 armored trains, workers with Winchester rifles, that went around the state shutting down, making sure the scabs couldn't come back and try to seize the railroads again. Amazing instance, an example of workers' power. Workers have a tremendous amount of power. They're just not organized to use it. Whereas the capitalists have the power of capital. They're a small group, 1%, maybe even less than 1%, really. But 1% is a good thing to use as distinct from the 99%. But anyway, these capitalists are very well organized. And so they're able to get the government on their side. They were able to use the media. They're able to use educational institutions, think tanks like the Council on Foreign Relations, which I'm also very interested in, the power structure. They're able to organize and unite themselves, come to a common consensus, and become a class for itself. They're a class in itself, but the ruling class, that is the capitalist class, they're a class for itself. The working class is a class in itself, but it's not a class for itself. It's not organized that way. And so we need to be organizing that, and that's one of the exciting things about Occupy. A lot of very class-conscious people are in the Occupy movement, and that's very encouraging because we have to be class-conscious, I think.
I'm talking to Larry Shoup about his book, Rulers and Rebels, The People's History of Early California, 1769 to 1901. The book he just referred to, by the way, is his first book that has now been reprinted, Imperial Brain Trust, The Council on Foreign Relations and United States Foreign Policy. So you find a new copy of that. You can go to our website for all of this information at indeepradio.com. Let me go back to that question you brought up about who owns the media. We have just a couple minutes left in this segment, but obviously when we're talking early California history, they weren't tweeting to each other and they weren't blogging. And we've seen a lot of power emerge for organization, dispersal of information, setting up strategies. And in a time when not only do we not have that instantaneous transmission of information, but there was also, a very distinct line about who owned all the media. How did these organizers meet the challenges? How did these nascent unions meet the challenges?
Well, first it was, of course, newspapers. And there were a lot of different newspapers at that time. But they were all owned by small groups of leading capitalists. And they didn't cooperate. They didn't, as far as I know, they didn't have the same kind of cooperation. Like, for example, the Council on Foreign Relations, I've just finished, I'm writing a new book updating the Imperial Brain Trust. I just finished Chapter 2. And that is the Council Connections, the network of the Council, and it includes media. So I started looking at all the top media. You name the media, CBS, NBC, New York Times, Washington Post, et cetera, and they're all interconnected with the Council on Foreign Relations. They have council directors or council members that are part of their board of trustees, and they're leading journalists, the big names, the Diane Sawyer and Dan Rather and you name the Bob Schieffer, or you name the big media person on the television, and they're usually in the Council on Foreign Relations. Not 100%, but oftentimes.
That's fascinating. I had no idea. That's fascinating.
It's amazing how far this. It's a membership organization for over 4,500 people. So it's a large group of people. So the council's a big, center for this network. I don't think there's anything equivalent in the 19th century. They had a lot of different newspapers, and sometimes they conflicted. They had newspaper, wars of different kinds in the sense that they would be against the other owner. So the Hearst versus the Youngs, for example, that's the Chronicle versus the Examiner. And it was good for me on this because when I was researching the 1901 general strike on the waterfront, the Examiner was favorable to the workers, and the Chronicle was not. So I read a lot of stuff from the Examiner, so that was very helpful. So in answer to your question, I don't think that there was the same kind of coordination back then as there is now.
And yet there were some victories on the union side, the progressive side. So we're going to cover that into our next segment. And I'm going to stay, Larry Shoup's here for the hour. So we're going to continue to talk about his book, about the reflections on Occupy, and maybe some of the lessons that can be applied as we move into, yet another era of rulers and rebels. I'm Angie Coiro. You're listening to In Deep. Our Facebook page is In Deep with Angie Coiro. Welcome back to In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro, and we're talking about, it's an historic view on Occupy and on rulers and rebels throughout time. That's the name of the book by Lawrence Shoup. He's in the studio with me now. It's A People's History of Early California, 1769 to 1901, and the lessons that were learned then, the stories that can be told of not just the oppressors, but from the oppressed at that time, that lessons we may be able to apply today. Before we took our break, we were talking about the fact that in California and in the records that you found, the workers and the protesters found a voice with the Examiner. So let's examine that a little bit. To what end? How did it serve the Examiner to be the voice of the workers? Because you'd have to assume it's easier as a media entity to side with the people with money.
But you want to sell newspapers. And William Randolph Hearst at that time, was the head of the Examiner. And it was a young William Randolph Hearst. I mean, this was a man that lived into the 1950s. So in his earlier period, he was kind of a populist guy. He wanted to compete against the biggest newspapers in the country and in the world, the Pulitzer chain, for example. And so he wanted to appeal to people who were buying newspapers. It was a literate public. At that time, people were very interested in education and learning more. You didn't have the distractions. Today, there's a million distractions that keep you from reading. And that's going to be a problem, I think, in our society, is that there's all these things you can be doing instead of reading. In those days, of course, you were reading, and newspapers were a very big thing. So Hearst wanted to sell newspapers, and that competitive aspect of capitalism is always part of it, and part of it, something that's always there. And so he wanted to sell newspapers, and that's the reason why he sided with the workers. He also wanted to be elected to office. He was running for office at that time, but he had this real squeaky, funny voice, William Randolph Hearst. So he never got elected to very much. I think he did become a state senator in New York or something, but he wanted to run. He ran for governor, and of course eventually he wanted to become president, but he failed in those endeavors. He ran for governor of New York, but he failed. He didn't win. He had this kind of a squeaky voice, and even though his newspapers promoted him, as time developed, Hearst, of course, broadened out into movies, and started doing a lot of movies, and he broadened out into a lot of magazines. So he was all around in terms of trying to influence the public in various ways, and he became reactionary over time, very reactionary. But in this period, he had some populist aspects. He wanted to be elected to office. He was even a Democrat at this time. So he was sympathetic, some sympathy to the workers, number one, and then number two, of course, he wanted to sell newspapers.
Were there Warren Buffetts at the time? Were there people in what we now call the 1% who said the workers need to be represented? It's for the good of the country, that, we need to raise all the classes? Oh,
there were. I'm trying to think of any. and I wouldn't overstate how wonderful Warren Buffett is. I mean, of course, he did say that, ruling class people, the 1% should be taxed more and so on. And interestingly enough, he's not in the Council on Foreign Relations. And neither is Gates, actually, but a whole lot of the billionaires that we would name are in the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations is a capitalist class organization, and the Rockefellers have been very prominent in it for many, many decades. David Rockefeller joined the council, or was invited to join the council. That's how you get into the Council on Foreign Relations. In 1941, David Rockefeller, he's still a member. He first got in 1941, and he was chairman for a very long time. So the council represents this capitalist class, but there's some people that aren't in it, and Buffett's not in it, but he still owns all these companies that aren't exactly paying their workers great wages or, giving them wonderful health care and benefits. That's not the case. So we don't want to say that Buffett is so wonderful. I mean, he's better than some of the others. I'm trying to think, though, about your question about the 19th century, whether there were any capitalists that were really sympathetic to the workers, and I can't think of any. The class struggle was pretty sharp, and the capitalists were pretty ruthless as far as suppressing people, including using gun thugs to shoot up the workers' rallies and various things like that, and having Pinkertons, these Pinkerton cops, private police, private security were a big thing in those days, and they would infiltrate and try to destroy unions. So there's a lot of cases that just showed the oppressive nature, and of course that's why the class struggle was very sharp at that time, and now it's becoming sharp now.
Well, it also goes to the questions that we're facing today about who owns the government, who owns the police, who do they serve. Right on the cover of your book, we see a sketch of the U.S. cavalry going after strikers.
Yes.
And ostensibly, our police and our government come from among us. They are us. We not only own them, we are them. But it's these times of sharp rebellion that you see. It's very questionable who owns whom.
Yeah. Well, it's to me, it's very clear that the capitalist class, the ruling class, runs the government, owns the government, pays the politicians, and pays the police and the army, and they're all beholden. But that is not to say that the police and army don't come out of the working class. They do. And in historical situations where you've seen, things get overthrown, things get changed, you see it's when the police and the army refuse to fire on the workers or refuse to fire on the demonstrators. That's when the old regime collapses. That was true in Tsarist Russia. That was true in Iran in 1979. You can name all kinds of historical examples where when things change is when the working class that is being employed as the repressors by the ruling class give up on the repression and side with the masses of the people. And that's what we have to aim for. So you have to understand that the police are a repressive force. They are controlled by this ruling class, that I call it, that's running everything, the 1%. But we have to try to, at the same time, appeal to them. It's not easy. They're trained to repress us. They're paid to repress us. But they are part of us. They come from working people. They come from the 99%. So there's a dialectical aspect to it, that on the one side you have to understand what they're going to be doing. On the other hand, you have to try to reach them somehow, because that's the way you're going to win ultimately. Because I think, and it looks to me like, things are going to get worse and worse in this country as far as the employment, as far as wages for people, the situation, the destruction of the ecology that I talked about before. That's all going to get worse. And so we are going to face a situation that's more reminiscent of other countries than it has been of the United States. I mean, we're relatively wealthy in the United States, so average people can, afford their iPads and all the things that they like to have. That's going to become a thing of the past, I think, in the coming decade. And so we have to be able to try to appeal to these repressive forces, because elections now are controlled. First of all, we have this, very bad winner-take-all system. We don't have proportional representation. We don't have instant runoff voting in most venues. We have a few on a local level, but instant runoff voting is where there's no spoiling, because you can rank your choices.
Right.
So, the Democrats are always blaming the Greens or some other third party for taking away their votes. Whereas if they implemented a system that was fair, that is, when you rank people and then if someone gets 150% of the first place votes, then they win. But if they don't, then you start counting the second place and even the third place votes to find out who wins. It's called instant runoff voting. They use it in Oakland. They use it in San Francisco. But they don't use it nationwide to elect the president, which they should. But, of course, the main parties, the capitalist parties, they're also called the Titanic parties. We call them the Titanic parties.
I hadn't heard that one.
Those parties, driving us into the iceberg off the cliff, they don't want to have third parties to have a real say. They exclude third parties from the debates. They don't give their media don't give third parties any publicity.
So the concept of the spoiler vote actually works in their favor.
Of course, yeah, because then you're forced to vote for the Democrats because you don't want those terrible Republicans to get in. And the Republicans are terrible, but so are the Democrats, just a little bit less terrible. I mean, if you look at Obama, we could go into a long story about how he's been, in some ways, worse than Bush. I know a lot of people don't like to hear that, but that's actually true. If you look at the policies, they're just as bad in many cases. There's a few things that are a little bit better, but not worth it. So anyway, I'm making a long thing getting into the election system because that's a hopeless, I think, at least the way it's organized now. We don't have a real democracy. It's a phony democracy. And so we're going to have to be doing the direct action that Occupy has been pushing. We're going to have to do that on a longer term to try to change the system. That's the way we're going to have to do it. And that's the way it has been done historically in any case.
Well, one thing that I think is dangerous in our society is it's easy to fall into absolutes. One of the things, and I do want to go with where you just went with Barack Obama, there's a constant rumbling dialogue about when it's appropriate to criticize Barack Obama. And I am torn on this as well. I mean, you see what he has done with the CIA. You see what he's done with the telecoms. You see some of the policies that he's gone to court to defend that were just appalling to all of us. One of the reasons that he got voted in was because we found what was happening in the courts galling, and he continues to pursue them on his own strength, not as a Bush heritage, but on his own strength. Yet at the same time, I would absolutely be devastated on behalf of my country if Barack Obama does not get back in. because I can look at a Mitt Romney and say, we're all going to go to hell in a handbasket. So, it's difficult to have that dialogue and to wonder about the timing of the dialogue, because the last thing I want to do is discourage anybody from going to the voting booth. I don't want anybody sitting at home saying, oh, they're all the same. It doesn't matter. We've got the Supreme Court to worry about. We've got the far right to worry about. We've got the fundamentalist religious to worry about. And at least as far as we can see, Barack Obama is substantially different there. So, again, it's a question of, do you make the critique? And if you make it, when do you make it? And what's the cost of making it?
Well, there's a whole lot of aspects to this, but let me just start on the local level. We live in California. Barack Obama is going to win this state by, 60%? Mm-hmm. Way overwhelming. So that's, to starters, that means we have a choice not to vote for Barack Obama if we want to. And there's a very good Green candidate right now called Jill Stein. Her name is Jill Stein. She's a medical doctor in Massachusetts. She's run for governor there and got almost 20%. She's been with the Occupy in Boston there in Massachusetts. And her program is totally for the rank-and-file people. Single-payer health care, an end to U.S. imperialism, full employment, worker-owned businesses, government funding for of jobs like you had under the Roosevelt. I mean, why hasn't Barack Obama, with all this unemployment, taken a page out of Roosevelt's book? Roosevelt was a Democrat. Why? That's not revolutionary or anything. That would give people employment. Why doesn't he take some of that money that's being wasted on these wars and put it into full employment for the people? Why doesn't Barack Obama do that? Anyway, Jill Stein wants to do that. So we can vote in California for whoever we want. And in fact, there's only 12 states in the whole country that are in question. All the others are either going to go for Romney, or they're going to go for Obama.
But
there's only 12.
Dialogue now crosses state boundaries,
all the other states,
though.
You can vote for whoever you want, and Jill Stein is the right person to vote for. Anyway,
but the dialogue is important, because dialogue crosses state lines. We can say in California who you vote for is one thing, but the dialogue that you're having on the internet, on the airwaves, that isn't state specific. So if I take my time now to criticize Barack Obama vehemently, and justifiably in many cases, right. My great fear is that I'm encouraging people in those 12 critical states to sit on their butts and not go in.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a tough one, because I see some difference between Barack Obama and Romney. But unfortunately, for me, it's not a big enough difference. We need something different than what either one of them is offering for this country really to do what it should be doing in the world and should be doing for its own people. Barack Obama's terrible policies on foreign policy, it's just U.S. imperialism all the way, drones, war crimes, even torture, are being continued, and, not upholding the law. I mean, it's just too terrible. And then you say, yes, well, the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court's already in the hands of the right wing. 5-4 decisions are already going for the right wing. And the Republicans that put those right-wing people in, put young ones in. They're not going to change
not
in the
stupid.
next 4 years.
They may be many things. They're not stupid.
So I don't think that argument carries.
Oh, wait, you're not a woman. You're not a woman.
Okay. And Romney might switch to, you might be surprised at Romney being, further to once he gets in office and doesn't have to cater to the right wing. He's a moderate Republican. And that's what Barack Obama is. They're both moderate Republicans.
I don't want to be surprised by what happens to women's rights on the Supreme Court. I don't want surprises. I don't want to buy a pig in a poke. One thing I can tell you about Barack, this is exactly what I hoped would happen. When we brought Larry Shoup into the studio today, I said, this is a guy who's going to give us some great dialogue. So getting to that, let me remind you, if you're just tuning in, Larry Shoup is the author of Rulers and Rebels, A People's History of Early California, 1769 to 1901, and Imperial Brain Trust, just back in print, The Council on Foreign Relations and United States Foreign Policy. We're talking about Occupy, we're talking about the class system, and at the moment, we're arguing about the Supreme Court because, and I do think that this is one clear and critical division between Dems and Repubs. They are alike in many more ways than I'd like them to be. But I believe the Republican war on women is a reality. There are, the rights being lost across the states are astounding. Not just the dialogues we're having that we had 30, 40 years ago, but the laws that are being enacted. And based on that alone, I think that's a key decision for Barack Obama to get those next votes on the Supreme Court. I have no doubt he is absolutely pro-choice, and he absolutely doesn't want to be sticking probes into a woman's body when she wants a standard health procedure.
Yeah. There's no doubt that the Republicans are going further to the right. But how do we counter that? Do we counter that by not putting forth a clear alternative to both of these corrupt corporate political parties? And I think we have to put forward a clear alternative and also argue for both direct action and a different electoral system that would get us, including a different financing system for the candidates, that would get us closer to a real democracy. When are we going to start making those changes? If we're always going to say, well, we have to vote for these Democrat lesser evils, that's still voting for evil all the time, and that's a pretty poor kind of democracy. We have to get beyond that, and I think the way we get beyond that is first we break with these Democrats and have such a powerful movement in the country that the Republicans, if they do get in office, they can't do anything against it because the backlash is going to be so strong. It's going to lead towards the revolution that we want and that they're scared about. And that's why they're repressing the Occupy people all the time and the cops attacking them because they're really scared of the working class getting together and having some direct action that's radical.
You know who my heart is always with when I see these clashes? I know there are police on those front lines who understand why the protesters are there. And it's as you were saying, at some point in a revolution, it gets to the point where the military will drop their arms and no longer support the ruling class. And my heart is with those cops who are out there who already know what's going on. And I know they're there. I know they're torn. I know there are bad apples. I know there are good people. And there are those people who are right in the middle, not knowing what the hell to do, but knowing that the way it's working isn't working. So with that profound observation, we're going to take a brief break here on In Deep with Angie Coiro. You listen to Larry Shoup, an author of many books and a guy who worked within the education system for some time. And as you mentioned to me, not so much anymore. A bit too radical for those folks. Maybe we'll have a chance to get into that. We'll definitely get into right to work, and we're going to get into Citizens United and a number of other important issues that have come up since Occupy has brought these issues into other people's faces. So we'll be right back with all of that here on In Deep. Welcome back to In Deep. I'm Angie Coiro. My guest is Larry Shoup. His book, Rulers and Rebels, A People's History of Early California, 1769 to 1901, first brought him to my attention. I'm so glad we've delved into many areas he's covered in his other books as well. Imperial Brain Trust is out in a new printing, Council on Foreign Relations and United States Foreign Policy. And he's also the author of The Carter Presidency and Beyond, Power and Politics in the 1980s. Before we left, I mentioned Citizens United. And you can inform this, if you will, with your knowledge of earlier revolutions in America. Citizens United is so blatant in its effect on the elections that I prefer to think that even people who aren't paying that close of attention, who don't consider themselves political, can't help but hear the huge amounts of money being floated around now by the PACs and the super PACs and the buying of elections. Do you think that that is having an impact on who's open to listening now that may not have been before?
Oh, yes, of course. I think it starts to impact people, and they start listening more. This kind of problem has been around for a long time, of course. The campaign finance laws have been very weak for, centuries. And so that's a problem. And this whole thing about who can think of something more absurd than, corporations as people. And, of course, Romney says, yeah, of course they're people. A totally absurd position where the corporations have all the power and the rights, and real live human beings, don't. If you're not part of the 1%. Of course, you're part of the 1%, you have quite a few rights. And the other thing about this campaign finance thing that they threw out and then instituted the Citizens United rule is that it's secret. A lot of this funding can be secret, at least for a very long time. And so until after the election is over, I believe it could be so these corporations and wealthy individuals can spend unlimited amounts secretly to influence the process. It makes the democracy more and more of a sham. So for a real democracy, of course, we need publicly financed elections. We need proportional representation, instant runoff voting. We need also, I think, very important is to put the corporations under the people's control. That is through corporate charter reform. Corporations have to be chartered. They get chartered on a state level. They go to the Secretary of State and they fill out some paperwork and become chartered. In past times, looking back to the 19th century, corporations had to be chartered by the legislature. They had to have a legislative act in order to become a corporation. And of course, our founding fathers, many of them, were very much against corporations and thought corporations were extreme danger. There's the famous Jefferson quote about corporations, that's the death knell of democracy. They're going to have more power than the people. He predicted that. Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers, and the one that I think is the most admirable among that group is Thomas Jefferson, despite his owning slaves and all the rest of it. Nevertheless, among that group, he was the most admirable one, and he predicted the danger of these corporations. And we can put them under our control. All we have to do is have corporate charter reform. That is, make some rules. You can't corrupt our political system. You can't have workers that are not allowed to join unions. Because they typically now, corporations, someone tries to organize a union. My own relatives have been fired for trying to organize unions. Mm-hmm. The corporation just fires them, gets rid of them. So that unions that's one reason why we're down to somewhere around 11% of the workforce in the United States is in a union. 89% of the workers in the United States are not in a union. Why is that? When you ask, if you have interview workers, would you like to be in a union? It's over 50% would like to be in a union. Of course, there's a lot of prejudice against unions because unions aren't perfect either. Right. A lot of them are undemocratic, and I have very strong criticisms of a lot of unions that are undemocratic. But there's some very good ones that are very democratic and fight for their workers, and they're the model that we want to work towards in some ways. Of course, we want to have workers control more and more things. We want to have workers control the whole society.
You're just a downright socialist, aren't you? Yes. Well, are you a socialist or a fascist? I can't remember the current definitions today.
Well, I'm definitely against fascism. I've always been against that. But I'm kind of, a combination of IWW, anarchist, syndicalist, a Marxist, a real what Marx really wanted, which was workers' control, an end to the slave-like division of labor. It was one of the main things that Marx talked about, was that human beings were being warped and not developing their full potential because they had to be forced on an assembly line or whatever it was, to be automatons. And they weren't developing their human potential. They had to work, 12 hours a day, 15 hours a day. The 8-hour day was one thing Marx was fighting for. He was always fighting for the workers and for the rank and file people. He believed in humanity, the wonderfulness of humanity, the potential of humanity, and he saw capitalism as destroying that and warping that. So I'm a Marxist in that sense too. Of course, Marx had so many things that are right. I think if you're going to read someone, you should read Marx and you should read Capital, because that's one of the main things that's going on now, is capital, as Marx predicted, is coming up against itself. And so it's having more and more trouble having full employment. It's having more and more trouble having profit. And so they're taking it out on the workers. They're taking it out on the environment. And so that's the future if we have capitalism. Well, it's going to destroy the environment.
Let me interrupt you there, because
humanity.
You're touching on something I think is really important, and that is these labels, Marxist, socialist, fascist, communist, I think are an example of how well the right-wing messaging machine works. Yes. Because they're interchangeable in many minds. They essentially mean bad.
Right.
I could sit here and have a conversation with you about the relative benefits of capitalism. I'm a capitalist. I'm a capitalist with socialist overtones. I'm not a pure anything. And yet I'm aware that for the larger part of the population, those aren't labels that have actual meaning and have definitions about this is where the money goes and this is who owns what. What it is a good person versus a bad person. And if you sit most people down and say, here's a pencil, tell me the difference between socialism and communism. Tell me the difference between, unfettered capitalism and a modified capitalism. It doesn't mean anything. And my great distress around that is how good the right is with messaging. By painting things in big cartoon colors, it's so easily digestible. We all lose by that.
They have a much bigger microphone than we have, too.
Well,
they have access to the media. They have access to the media in ways that we do not. All the media, the print media, the broadcast media, they have access to it, and the left does not. And so we typically get characterized and, distorted our views. But it's all about democracy. Marx was a profound humanitarian, a profound Democrat, believing in humanitarian and democratic values. That's what Marx was all about. And if you ask the average person, of course, Marx, well, again, like you say, has a very bad opinion. Have you ever read anything by Marx? No. Do you know anything about Marx? No, but didn't he sponsor the Soviet Union? Well, of course, Marx had been dead for many, many decades by the time the Soviet Union was founded, and I'm sure he would have repudiated it. That it wasn't freedom. He was for human freedom. And so that's why I think he can make a tremendous contribution. People should read Marx. But anyway, yes, I'm a Marxist, but I'm also a humanitarian, and like Marx was. And I also believe in the IWW. That's a good democratic union that tried to organize the unorganized and those who were particularly oppressed, those that had the worst type of jobs, unskilled workers, etc. So, as any person, I'm very complicated, just like you, are a combination of capitalism and socialism.
Larry Shoup's my guest. His book, Rulers and Rebels, is the primary point of our discussion. It's a people's history of early California. You can find links to that and to the other books we're discussing and to some of the other issues we're discussing all at our website, indeepradio.com. Let's go back to the history that we started the hour with, which is captured in your book. I'm thinking today of the power that's in the hands of the jesters. And by that I refer to Jon Stewart, who did the most fabulous, thorough takedown of the hypocrisy of the right's attacks on Barack Obama earlier this week. And then you go back to, several White House Correspondents' dinners back, and you see what Stephen Colbert did. And here he was really calling people honestly on their stuff, not just the president, but the press. Jon Stewart sits there every night and calls out the Republicans and the Democrats and the liberals and the whoever is dealing in hypocrisy. Was there any comparable jester at the time that we look back at now and say, thank God we had them, somebody who managed through whatever means to seize the larger ear, to transcend that issue of class and be able to speak truth to power? Was there anyone of that type?
No jesters that I think of in the 19th century California. Nothing comes to mind. Will Rogers comes to mind for the 20s.
Absolutely.
He was very good.
Yeah.
But for the 19th century, I just don't. Bryce was pretty sarcastic, and he wrote in some of the newspapers. Ambrose, I believe his first name was. He was pretty sarcastic, but he wasn't really a jester. I don't think they had that. For one thing, we're talking about print media, and broadcast media allows it much more.
Yes.
Because you can see gestures and you can see, facial expressions, etc., on the broadcast media, particularly television, but not on the print media.
You did have the power of the political cartoon.
Did have political cartoons, but I haven't really studied enough. I've looked at a lot of newspapers back then, but I didn't, do any particular study of the political cartoons. Yeah.
When you're looking at the voices from that history, one of the things in the description of your book that struck me is that it is about the voices from the people, from the rebels, etc. Yeah. And you mentioned earlier that the Examiner was one outlet in California where the people who were oppressed had a voice. But for the most part, history is written by the winners. History is written by the people with money. Yeah. Tell me how you unearthed some of these voices.
Oh, well, it's from the newspapers, really. And sometimes there were these equivalent of a leaflet that they would post somewhere. And so I was able to get some of those. The Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley has a tremendous collection of varied kinds of things. And so I was able to get some of those kinds of things, announcing, mass rallies, things like that. The 8-hour day, the fight for the 8-hour day. The fight for the 8-hour day, of course, led to May Day, in 1886. But it goes back much further. In the 1860s, there was something called the National Labor Union that was active in California and fighting for the 8-hour day. And actually, the 8-hour day was passed in the state legislature in the 1860s. But then it was overturned by the Supreme Court, and it didn't take effect for much later. So, you had people fighting for these things from a very early date, and sometimes they were able to have some success, but then it was overturned oftentimes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
When you look at the rulings of the Supreme Court through time, you were referring to the ones in early California, and then we had the Gilded Age, and we had some of, correct me if I'm wrong, I think some of FDR's work and some of the programs he put up were challenged.
The Supreme Court overthrew that in the 1938, I believe it was.
Yes.
37, 38.
So we see that same fluctuation.
The reactionaries, that's the nature of the American political system. It has many levels. You have two different halves of the legislature, so that both of them have to be passed. A law has to be passed, then the president has to sign it. Then the judiciary can challenge it. So democracy is channeled and controlled, and not just through the fact that the media has so much power and that the big contributors have so much power and the parties have so much power and the corporations have so much power, but also it's structurally set up not to be a full democracy. Mm-hmm. A full democracy would be a unicameral legislature. You wouldn't have to have both of them, and it wouldn't be challenged by the judiciary all the time. The laws wouldn't be challenged by the judiciary. So we're a far cry from a real democracy, and that's what we need to be fighting for, I think, is a real democracy, full democracy for the people. And that should go right down to the factory level. The workers should be making the decisions in the factory and in the businesses. You should have a worker-run society. That's what I ultimately would like to see.
Now, see, this is where you and I would part the ways. I'm for a modified capitalism. I love the thought of a human being being able to fulfill their greatest potential if their dream is to have a company and their dream is to grow it and to make it work. I think there is a line that gets crossed when you start to view the workers as cogs instead of people. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that, they need to be able to run the factory that I have created and that I've put my heart and soul into, and that was my vision. I do think that no matter how successful I am, I don't have the right to treat them as less than full human beings who have their own dreams, their own pursuit of dreams, and their own rights to be treated well.
Yeah. Well, that's where I guess we would part company, because I think even if an entrepreneur, and you need entrepreneur leader types to start things, but then they should be open to the contributions of every person. And every person has something to contribute. And so there should be these factories, these enterprises should be democratically run and democratically operated.
I can see the limitations of that when I look at what happens with Occupy, though. The limitations of a full democracy I don't think always take advantage of the strength of a strong organizational force. If we look, for example, you were talking earlier about why Barack Obama isn't just taking a page from FDR's book and doing what he's doing. And I think that's representative of the fear and timidity that Democrats tend to move with. Whether they know what's the right thing to do or not, they're constantly in a defensive position. And when I look at Occupy, I see them accommodating so many voices, from the pacifists to the black bloc and to everyone in between, that sometimes they muddle their own message and they're ineffective. Long story short is, from Barack Obama to the factory to Occupy, I think there's a place for strong leaders and for the buck to stop somewhere.
Well, there's a place for strong leaders. You have to have a balance. You have to have leadership, but you also have to have active mass participation. If you go too far in either direction, you can have problems. So you have to have active leaders, but you also have to have people participating and pulling their lives into whatever it is, whatever endeavor it is, whether it's production for use rather than exchange. And I'm for production for use, not exchange. Exchange leads to capitalism. Production for use is what you want. And that's the kind of society that we have to have for humanity and for the ecology to survive, I think.
From
use value and democracy, full democracy. But anyway, you need both, I think. You need leadership, but you also need mass participation. And then in our society, we've gone way far away from mass participation towards leadership running everything, the 1%.
We've only got about 60 seconds left, and I'd love to get whatever lessons, brief, concise lesson, you would like to pass on to Occupy from all the studying you've done of the previous revolutions.
Carry on the struggle and always make it as democratic and inclusive and transparent as possible. And also I would want to say is we have to keep it nonviolent and non-property destructive, particularly at this point when we're trying to reach larger audiences. The ruling class will use property destruction and violence against us and make sure that our movement stays small and marginalized. And so we have to have the opposite of that is what we need. That is inclusiveness, democracy, and nonviolence.
This has been a joy. I held my tongue on the Marxism because that's not what we're about to start. Come on back, we'll argue, okay?
Okay.
All right. Larry Shoup's book is
Sounds
Rulers
good.
and Rebels, A People's History of Ely, California, 1769 to 1901. And that's a wrap for this week. Our executive producer is Gordon Whiting. Our engineer is Matt Fiddler. Assistant producer Sydney Myers. Jill Fiddler runs everything else around here. Our incredible interns are Forrest Phillips, Kristen Stevens, and Megan Mena. Special thanks this week to Rose Aguilar at KALW, who's doing a great job following Occupy. You can follow us on Twitter at In Deep Radio. Our theme is by Big Troubles. Closing theme, back there, by David Gans. Visit our site for web extras from GottaLaff and more. We'll see you next week. Thanks. I'm Angie Coiro.
Yes, I know it's gonna get better, 'cause it almost always does. I can't say much about the who.
Thanks for tuning in this week to In Deep with Angie Coiro, a production of TalkBack Studios. You can get more information about us at indeepradio.com. And while you're there, you can become a member and support our work. There's a link there to contact us, too, with any questions or feedback. We're developing a series on mental health issues in our country, especially in this economy, and we'd love to have you be part of that. Please send us your topic suggestions, your stories, and your questions through our website. Click the contact button at indeepradio.com. Join us again this time next week for 2 more hours of in-depth conversation. I'm Angie Coiro. We'll see you then. You're listening to WPWC 1480 AM, Dumfries, Virginia. We Act Radio, home of Washington's progressive working community.